Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of 1968. We're continuing to look at international protests throughout the year 1968, and in recent lectures we've talked about China, Japan, and Yugoslavia. In this lecture, we'll turn to events in Northern Ireland. In October 1968, protests of a different sort flared up in Derry, Northern Ireland. There, protesters marched against unbelievably harsh and unfair policies under British rule. In working-class Derry, unemployment approached 30%, and many citizens lived in poverty in very poor conditions. Voting rights were determined by income and taxpayer rate, so most of the citizens had no vote, while landlords and British officials often cast dozens of votes based on their own high incomes. The poor citizens of Derry chafed at the dismal conditions and at the arrogance of their British overseers. In February 1968, Derry citizens gathered to form the Derry Housing Action Committee. They launched a campaign of civil disobedience, drawing as inspiration the American Civil Rights Movement. They marched and demonstrated outside of official meetings, held sit-ins, refused to pay rent, and in one instance used a camper that one family was living in to block the streets as a protest against the poor housing situation. The protests grew in visibility and support throughout the year, and on October 5th, they called for a civil rights march. The Northern Ireland Home Affairs Minister, William Craig, refused to authorize the march, setting the stage for a clash between the marchers and the police, who were called the Royal Ulster Constabulary Police, the RUC. As the marchers wound their way through the poor and narrow streets of Derry, they found their way blocked by a police unit. It's worth noting that these protesters, unlike most that we've discussed to this point in the course, were not students. They were adults, even elderly, workers and parents and homeowners. They debated what to do. Many wanted to call off the march, not wanting to be arrested. But some urged the protest to continue, shouting, "What about Vietnam?" Or, "What about the Mexican students?" Before the marchers could decide on a course of action, the police attacked. The assault was vicious, as the panicked marchers had nowhere to run. Some tried to pack into doorways of apartments or shops along the road, but police pulled them back out and beat them mercilessly. Water cannons arrived and blasted marchers back into the path of the police, who beat them. Eventually, the remaining marchers escaped and managed to throw up barricades in the streets, like the students in Paris. They piled up anything they could find to block the police and threw rocks, bricks, and Molotov cocktails. More than 20 people were hospitalized. The following day, the marches and clashes resumed, with similar results. Makeshift barricades were erected in the streets, and nearly 100 people wound up in the hospital by the end of the night. The protesters called for the resignation of Minister Craig for his endorsement of the violence, but he was uncompromising and unapologetic. By October 9th, a few days later, the protests in support of Derry's townspeople had spread to Belfast, where a huge group of students from Queen's University launched a sit-down strike opposing the violence in Derry, and that's what you see pictured on the screen. The student protesters were surrounded by police and a group of counter-protesters who supported the authorities and the crackdown on protest. As night fell, the students grew anxious. One student leader finally addressed the crowd. "If there is bloodshed in Belfast tonight, there will be a return to violence and pogroms all over Northern Ireland. We have made our point. Let us now go home with a little dignity." The protest then evaporated for the night, but the grievances that sparked the protest remained unaddressed. The movement flared up again in November, when the activists arrested on October 5th went on trial. While they were freed, the jubilation of the celebrating crowd incited yet another crackdown by the police. Workers in the area walked out in support of the victims, and once again the streets of Derry were alive with the protests of 1968. The students in Belfast as well resumed their protests. For the duration of 1968, there were student sit-down demonstrations and meetings, often numbering in the thousands. In January 1969, the students organized a march from Belfast to Derry, modeled on the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The marchers were attacked several times along the way, and their arrival in Derry set off a 5-day vicious battle with the authorities, leaving dozens hospitalized. The clashes were on again, off again, well into the next year, as officials wavered between compromise and crackdown. Prime Minister Terence O'Neill attempted to ease tensions and navigate a middle ground between the protesters, who were mostly Catholic, and more hardline Protestant leaders. He was never able to implement the one-man, one-vote demand that protesters wanted, and it took more than a year and a change in leadership for that policy to be introduced. Even so, the conflict in Northern Ireland continued until well into the 1970s. In our next lectures, we'll turn to yet one more country that was racked by the protests and chaos of 1968, the nation of Mexico.